Have you ever wondered what it would be like to see the world as it was before the flood? Picture this: a vast, chaotic world, loud, busy, full of distractions, people living as if there was no tomorrow. Now imagine one man, standing against the tide and listening when everyone else thought he was out of his mind. This was Noah, a man who was called to build a boat, not just for himself, but for humanity's future. And the kicker? He had no idea what a flood was, but he obeyed anyway. Why? Because God told him to. In 2 Peter 2 verse 5, we read, "If he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly." It's a profound reminder of the seriousness of righteousness and the consequences of ignoring it. But let's not get too heavy just yet. Let's pause for a second and think about it. What would you do if you were Noah? You're living in a world that thinks you've lost your marbles. You're the guy in town with the biggest, weirdest construction project, and people are laughing at you. I can just imagine the scene. Neighbors come by, pointing and chuckling. Look, there's Noah, still hammering away at his boat in the desert. Maybe the guy's lost his mind. It's easy to romanticize Noah's story, but when you look closer, it's clear how much courage and faith it took to follow through. He wasn't just building a boat. He was building a bridge to a new world, even though the old world didn't believe it was coming. And that's the part that really gets me. He knew the flood was coming, even though he had never seen one. Let me take you to another Bible story that echoes this same theme of faith in the face of disbelief. The story of Abraham. You know, the one where God promises Abraham descendants as numerous as the stars, even though at the time, Abraham didn't have a single child. Sarah, his wife, even laughed at the idea. She was beyond childbearing years, and yet God made it happen. You can almost picture Sarah's reaction when God first told her, "Yeah, right, God. Sure, a baby at this age. Maybe I'll get a miracle, but can we just skip the diapers and sleepless nights?" But God's timing doesn't always line up with our expectations. And what about Moses? Standing in front of Pharaoh, demanding the release of the Israelites? Who would have thought that a man with a stutter, a fugitive from Egypt, would be the one to lead an entire nation out of slavery? It must have seemed like a joke to Pharaoh. Moses? Really? This is your plan? I don't think so. But again, God's plan prevailed. Now, these stories are filled with moments that seem impossible, that make you want to chuckle at the sheer absurdity of it all. Like Moses turning a stick into a snake, or Abraham's wife laughing at God's promises. But these are the kinds of stories that build our faith. They remind us that sometimes, the seemingly impossible is exactly what God uses to change the world. So, what's the point? Well, what if I told you that we're living in a time where the flood is rising again, but this time, it's not a physical flood. The storm of distractions, self-sufficiency, and the pursuit of worldly success is swelling, and people are turning a blind eye to the rising tide of righteousness. The floodwaters of spiritual apathy are creeping in, and many are too distracted by the chaos of life to notice that God is calling us to build our own arks, to create spaces of faith, righteousness, and truth. We have a choice. We can build our arks now, or we can wait until the waters are too high to climb out of. Let's bring this into a more relatable scenario. Imagine you're at work. The atmosphere is full of gossip, pressure to cut corners, and people constantly talking about getting ahead at any cost. You're standing there with your lunch, thinking about the recent sermon on how we're supposed to be in the world, but not of it. It's hard, right? The world is so loud and distracting. It's like everyone else is building their flood by ignoring what really matters. And here you are, trying to build an ark of integrity, truth, and righteousness in the middle of it all. One of the best examples of standing firm in the face of a culture that was going completely off course comes from the book of Daniel. Remember the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? The king demanded that everyone bow down to a golden statue, her face being thrown into a fiery furnace. No pressure, right? But these 3 men refused to bow down. Imagine the scene. Everyone else is kneeling, the flames are roaring, and these 3 young men are standing there like, "We're good, thanks. Our God is bigger than that statue." They could have bowed. It would have been so easy to just blend in, to avoid the heat, literally and figuratively. But instead, they chose to stand firm. They chose righteousness over fear. And in the end, not only were they saved from the fire, but their faith led to the king praising their God. Back to Noah. His obedience wasn't just about him building a boat. It was about him making a stand in a world that was completely corrupt. He built something that would save him, his family, and all of humanity. The world was spiraling, but Noah's faith acted as the anchor in the chaos. And isn't that what we're called to do? Act as a beacon of faith in a world that doesn't seem to notice the rising flood? Now, let's bring this all home with a story from the New Testament. Peter himself, the author of the very verse we're studying, had to go through his own moment of reckoning. Remember when he denied Jesus 3 times? That wasn't just a small mistake. It was a moment of weakness in the face of pressure. But Peter didn't stay there. He was restored by Jesus, who asked him 3 times, "Do you love me?" Peter's restoration was not just about forgiving a mistake. It was about challenging Peter to move past his fear and into a bold, unshakable faith. Just like Peter, we have moments of doubt, moments when we're tempted to ignore the flood waters rising around us. We might wonder if we're strong enough to stand firm like Noah, or if we'll buckle under the pressure. But the story of Peter reminds us that God doesn't just leave us in our weaknesses. He calls us back, challenges us to be better, and equips us to stand firm. So, back to you. Right now, you're living in your own version of Noah's world. The floodwaters are rising, distractions, fears, and the pressures of life are starting to look overwhelming. The world is telling you to bow down, to fit in, to live for today and forget about tomorrow. But there's a better way. Like Noah, you're called to stand firm. Like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you're called to be bold. Like Peter, you're called to rise above your doubts and fear and embrace God's plan for your life. The flood is coming, of that we can be sure. But we can choose to build our ark now. We can choose righteousness over convenience. We can choose faith over fear. And when the floodwaters come, we will stand firm, just like those who went before us. Call to action. If you're ready to stand firm like Noah, like Peter, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, then share this message with someone who needs to hear it. Don't wait for the flood to come before you act. Like, share, and subscribe so we can build this ark of faith together.